Today's show is sponsored by Panoptica. Panoptica simplifies container deployment, monitoring, and security, protecting the entire application stack from build to runtime. Scalable across clusters and multi-cloud environments, Panoptica secures containers, serverless APIs, and Kubernetes with a unified view, reducing operational complexity and promoting collaboration by integrating with commonly used developer, SRE, and SecOps tools. Panoptica ensures compliance with regulatory mandates and CIS benchmarks for best practice conformity. Privacy teams can monitor API traffic and identify sensitive data while identifying open source components vulnerable to attacks that require patching. Proactively addressing security issues with Panoptica allows businesses to focus on mitigating critical risks and protecting their interest. Learn more about Panoptica today at panoptica.app. That's panoptica.app.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for Cloud News. But before I get into Cloud News, coming up after the break, we've got a really good guest this week. And at this point, friend of the show as well. We've got Joe Duffy, co-founder and CEO of Pulumi. And we're going to be doing an update to infrastructure as code, what's been going on in the space and what's really kind of changed in the last year or so. And in case you're not familiar with Pulumi, of course, they're a returning guests. They've been on the Cloudcast a number of times. First of all, quite a few years ago, and then, of course, last year on show 657. So right about 100 shows ago or so. So with that, we're going to jump into Cloud News. Now, Cloud News, we're going to spend too much time on it because, quite frankly, it was a slow week. I don't know if it's mainly just a little bit because a lot of the first round of fall events just happened. And so now we're taking a little bit of a breather, if you will. But a couple articles that were of interest this week. Number one, over at TechCrunch, they did an article on AI models and are they doomed to always hallucinate? And I found this article really fascinating because just the concept of AI and its ability to hallucinate, and if you're not familiar with that term, what they really just mean is it invents facts, right? Part of generative AI is you can ask the same question and not necessarily get the same response every single time. And in certain conditions, AIs have a tendency to also, if it doesn't know the answer, it tends to make things up. So this article really explains why this happens, where they tend to go off the rails. Is it possible to solve for it? When you say to solve for it, what does it really mean? A really good read. And so I definitely encourage you to go check it out if that's of interest to you. And for our second article, and really we only have two this week, another really good friend of the show, Rob Hirschfeld over at RackN. He did a really nice interview about infrastructure as code, a little bit of infrastructure as code, a little bit of talking about current trends in the markets, a little bit about his company Digital Rebar, and I really liked it, the title of it. Infrastructure as code is not YAML, which you have to kind of listen to it a little bit to get the meanings of all of that. But always great to hear from Rob and hear his insights around both infrastructure as code and platform engineering. And with that, I'm going to close out Cloud News for this week. And as we mentioned, coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to Joe Duffy, co-founder and CEO over at Pulumi, and we're going to be doing an update to infrastructure as code.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. Aaron, how are you, man? You and I have both one child or two child out the door, at partial empty nest. How are you? How are you and the missus, dealing with the realities of kids heading off to college?
Well, I'll simply say this: the house has been really, really quiet, but also too on a work front. Some folks have know I did some traveling for the day job, and unfortunately, came down with not COVID, believe it or not, but the flu and then bronchitis on top of it. So it's been a lot of recovery. And I don't know if I still sound 100% or not. We'll see. But I might have to go on mute to keep from coughing here and there. But it's been an interesting couple weeks, without a doubt.
Good. So for folks that are listening, Aaron is Agent Zero of COVID-23. Just to kind of keep that in mind. Stay away from him if you see him out and about in the wild. We are going to talk today about kind of the evolution that the last couple of years, couple of months, and kind of both in between have been a big evolution of what's going on with infrastructure as code, both kind of the technologies themselves, the communities that people think about when they're in this space. And we thought it would be good to dive back into that because obviously there's been a little bit of news, holistically in the industry, but I think as a whole, we're seeing more and more use cases in which the ability to deal with lots of infrastructure, whether it's like IoT or AI, people thinking about, how do I make sure that I'm managing my cloud efficiently? And so automation is back in the conversation. We really wanted to kind of dig back into that and get a bunch of different perspectives on what's going on in that space. And so really, really excited to have longtime friend of the show and returning guest, Joe Duffy, who is co-founder and CEO of Pulumi. Joe, welcome back to the show. Great to have you back.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You've been on a couple of times before, but it's been a little while. Why don't, before we dive into a lot of these things, give us both, I guess, a little bit of your background, but maybe more so, you've been, running and leading Pulumi for a while now. Kind of, for anybody that's not familiar with Pulumi, like give us just kind of where the company is today and where you guys are focused.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So my name's Joe Duffy. I worked in developer tools for a very long time. So a lot of people still know me from my time at Microsoft. Was an early engineer on .NET, helped with the C# programming language, actually led the project to open source .NET before leaving Microsoft to found Pulumi. And really started Pulumi, 6.5 years ago, largely because we perceived a really big unmet need in the market, especially around developers, but also around infrastructure teams. And, we thought of the cloud as it really changes everything about software development. You think of distributed architectures, containers, the way, observability becomes woven throughout the development process. And yet, from our perspective, serving the developers of the world, I was running developer tool strategy and managing the languages teams. Most developers I talked to they weren't really excited about the cloud. It was like, yeah, we still write 2-tier applications and throw it over the wall to our IT org, and they handle the rest. And then you go talk to the infrastructure teams of the world, and they were kind of like, oh man, we can't even keep up with the needs of the business. The tools that we're using are kind of crummy. It feels like we're recreating the wheel, and we're always behind. Yeah. And then, of course, leaders were not pleased because the team's just not working together as effectively as they should be able to. So we said, hey, let's take a step back and reimagine software development in a cloud-first way. And all paths led back to infrastructure as code. It wasn't obvious at first. We started with a new programming language. We tried to create some libraries, and really infrastructure as code met a need that wasn't there, which was, having this notion of a resource lifetime or a programmable surface area for the cloud. And once you have that, you can now build bigger things on top of that. That's a foundation. It's composable. And so we started with infrastructure as code, open source data. Open source has always been super important to everything we do. And now, fast forward 6+ years later, we're about to cross 2,000 paid customers, over 130,000 folks in the community, and growing super fast. And the interesting thing about Pulumi is, we work with developers equally as much as we work with infrastructure experts. So it really is that gateway between the two disciplines.
Nice, Joe. And it's funny, you mentioned 6.5 years ago. I mean, that's how long Pulumi's been around. And we first spoke 4 years ago or thereabouts, right? And So I've always liked to ask this question of like, hey, where are we at with infrastructure as code? Has this space kind of, I'll use air quotes here, settled down? Or do you still consider it kind of emerging in early innings? Are we evolving? Or is this kind of a more mature space now at this point?
Yeah, it's definitely still evolving, still very early innings. I think the foundational layers are thankfully relatively solid. The basics of infrastructure as code, the providers that give us access to AWS and Azure and Google Cloud and Kubernetes and all those great providers, those are rock solid. I think that the nice thing about that is it allows us to move up stack and think more about developer experience. I think the cloud is still way too difficult. You just think conceptually, if you're a developer, you go to a whiteboard and you draw, what does your microservice architecture look like? Well, it's a couple boxes connected to some data stores. Maybe you're building an AI app, right? And there's some like LLM models you need to host somewhere. Okay, now go encode that and all the different building blocks you need to run that on AWS. Wow. Okay, you're probably talking like 500 different boxes that need to connect, and you need to provision and manage. And most people aren't experts at everything. And so I think the future really is about moving up stack, much easier developer experiences. When we founded Pulumi, our vision was democratize the cloud, bring those amazing capabilities from all of those building blocks to as many engineers in the world as possible, regardless of what, whether they have a background in software development or infrastructure expertise, and super early innings on that path.
Yeah. We're always curious, and given, given how widely used Pulumi is and how long you guys have been doing this, we're always curious to sort of ask, the perspective that you get to see on some of these sort of bigger questions, sort of trends and so forth. So, I'm curious, how much are you seeing more and more people shifting towards kind of usage of one cloud primarily? Are we seeing, sort of, one and 1A, or are you still seeing a lot of, sort of the on-prem stuff plus cloud, and it's this sort of distributed thing? I'm curious, just kind of as, if somebody were to say, hey, kind of describe the, where are people using the cloud? Is it multi-cloud? Is it hybrid? Like, what's your sense of sort of ratio or trends of how that's sort of going?
Yeah, it's a great question because it has changed since we founded the company. I think multi-cloud was very much a topic, 5 years ago, and it still is, but I think it's evolved. It depends on the company and the industry and the use case that you're talking about. There's sort of like the enterprise use cases, then there's the born in the cloud startups, and then, maybe the folks that are sort of in between. I think with enterprises, very much still a hybrid world. Lots of virtual machines, lots of on-prem investments, some out of necessity because of security and compliance, some just due to legacy and folks are trying to modernize. Most of the time in the enterprises we talk to, I like your, 1A, 1B. Typically, there's a primary cloud, but then maybe a secondary cloud that is there for, maybe it's a better solution for some workloads, or maybe it's for price negotiation power for the CIO. So we definitely see that, but not as much, the write once, run on any cloud sort of pattern. That I think is more fiction than reality. I think the born in the cloud startups, interestingly, oftentimes they serve customers that are running in all the different clouds. And so, think of a Snowflake or a Cockroach Labs, both of which are customers of ours. They actually have to run in their customers' accounts, and it's their benefit to architect for multi-cloud so that they can support AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, wherever it is. And there's a lot of permutations of that. The one interesting subtlety that most people don't think of when they think of multi-cloud is there's this emergence of, let's call it the super cloud, which is, hey, my workload might use a little bit of AWS, a little bit of Kubernetes, but I might have a Cloudflare CDN in front of that. And I might be using a MongoDB database and maybe a Snowflake data warehouse. And maybe I'm outsourcing some of my AI to, yet another vendor. And you need a tool that can kind of orchestrate across all those boundaries. That is increasingly common. But when people say multi-cloud, I don't think they think about these, emerging SaaS providers that are really delivering cloud infrastructure.
Yeah, it's less and less about I like what you said there about like you run anywhere kind of scenario, or this multi-cloud scenario where everything's the same everywhere. It is a little bit of jigsaw puzzle pieces and using the right ones for the right purposes and then stitching them all together. And that's certainly a trend we've seen. And then another big trend, of course, is generative AI in particular. And Pulumi recently announced Pulumi Insights. Can you tell everyone a little bit about how that came to be and the problems you're trying to solve with Pulumi Insights as well?
For sure. I should mention AI companies have incredible infrastructure needs. And so we've seen a huge uptick in AI companies picking Pulumi because AI is kind of defined by just having infinite compute and infinite scale. So you really do need to tap into the cloud. But with Pulumi Insights, we launched that earlier this year. It really started with search, actually. That was, a little over a year ago, we started implementing search across all of your infrastructure because we kept hearing, it's just really hard to find what I'm looking for. I might know I have a log group, and in the moment firefighting, I'm trying to debug. I need to find that log group, but oh man, I have to log into the AWS console and then click around, and am I in the right region or am I not? And so it started with search. And then we actually added natural language search. So you could say, hey, do I have any MySQL databases that are on end-of-life versions? Or, hey, do I have any S3 buckets that are untagged? So a very natural way of querying your infrastructure. And I'd say around, December last year, we started exploring large language models and more AI techniques, because as we did search, what we realized is that data set, we have metadata about your infrastructure. We have metadata about every deployment you've ever done. That's a huge graph of information with semantic understanding because we're programming languages. And so we're able to build a data model on that we can then use to train AI and do ML-oriented things. And so we launched an AI product. And so Insights eventually is search, analytics, and AI over your infrastructure. And so you can take that data, you can export it to Snowflake and slice and dice it. But the AI part especially is really powerful because, you think of all the providers I mentioned earlier, how many services and how many ways to configure them are there? I mean, it's infinite, right? And sure, we have 20,000 examples, which is great. But what if we don't have that one specific example you were looking for? Hey, provision an EKS cluster with some GPU node pools and install some random Helm chart into it. We're not always going to have the example, but AI can give it to you no matter what it is. And that's because we've actually enlightened an LLM based on our data set, based on our APIs. And so if you go to Pulumi.com/AI, you can ask it anything, any architecture that you want, and we'll give you the code in whatever language you've chosen. So super powerful. Honestly, the fastest growing feature we've ever launched. Like all of our customers use it now almost on a daily basis.
Yeah. Is it okay to ask you a couple of questions about kind of how you went about creating that? I ask in the context of really two things. Obviously, lots of companies are excited about generative AI, and then they're trying to figure out how can I make this useful for me? I'm curious. You guys obviously had a data set of things that you had created, but probably a certain amount that came from the community too, right? Like it was public. Like how many developers did it take you to build your model, for example? Is that something that you can talk? I guess I'm asking just in the context of relative. If somebody's like, hey, I have a big data set, I want to build something. Was this something that took you like a month with like a person, or was this like a year-long project to kind of work through, or anywhere in between there?
Yeah, happy to discuss. We actually have a blog post that has some details, but it's a few months old at this point, and this is a rapidly evolving space. I think, honestly, our CTO, Luke, who you might have talked to in the past, but he helped create the TypeScript language at Microsoft. But he and I sort of hacked on it over the holidays, actually, to get it started. The nice thing about AI is it's sort of like an MVP. And so there's two questions. How fast can you get it to an MVP? And then what are the optimizations that you need to do afterwards to make it maximally useful? And the optimizations afterwards is the part that is just constantly evolving and changing. So we actually started with a GPT-based model. So at the time it was GPT 3.5. We eventually moved it to GPT 4. So the question is, what data does does Pulumi have? Or if you're a startup or company, what data do you have that, OpenAI didn't have when they trained the ChatGPT model? And those are all the areas where maybe a GPT-based thing is going to hallucinate. It starts with prompt engineering. You make sure you have the right prompts. You can guide it to answer the questions in the way you want. So for example, in our case, we wanted to give you the code, and we wanted to tell you if it's not sure if it's correct or not. So there's some things you can control there. But then ultimately we did, custom embeddings and fine tuning of the models based on our data set. And so we used, we're actually a customer of Pinecone, who is a customer of ours as well. And that allowed us to use a vector database to compress a lot of this knowledge and use that in the context of the prompts and the embeddings. And so that allowed us to just deliver much more accurate information. And over time, we're personalizing those models. So every organization can get custom information that's tailored to their unique data set. We have used, llama-based models and training, so we're constantly experimenting with how to deliver higher quality. But that's the part that it's kind of maddening. Every week there's a new technique or a new model to stay on top of.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I appreciate that. And again, I'm not asking so much into to dive into sort of the details, but to just as we're hearing people kind of tell stories about, hey, we built this model and it's providing these results. I'm always curious, like, was that a small undertaking? Was it huge? Was it iterative? So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Cool. Fantastic. And so, Joe, let me ask you this as maybe a next question. So let's talk about culture for a little bit, right? Because I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but, there's a lot of organizations out there, especially large organizations, right? The more groups they have, the more tools they have, the more clouds they have, and then you have to, at some point, standardize on some kind of abstraction and process to organize and make all of this infrastructure as code. And so for folks that are out there with this kind of complexity problem, if I use that term, right, what are the big hurdles that folks face a lot of times?
Yeah, it's a great question because we see them all the time across our broad customer base, and there's a lot of similarities. I think the biggest thing is, okay, what is the architecture we're trying to deliver, and how does that map to the underlying cloud provider, and how do we ensure we're doing that in a best practice way? And that best practice may mean secure, reliable, cost effective, all the great things, right? And so how do we actually encode that, and then how do we standardize that? And then as we standardize that, how do we enforce the standards across the team, allow the team to scale and move fast and evolve, as the business needs evolve? So you sort of want that standardization, but you don't want the standardization to come at the expense of velocity. And so one pattern we see a lot is we'll see the central platform team emerge. The platform team typically sits between the operational experts and the developers themselves. And their goal is to figure out, hey, we're going to use Kubernetes or we're not, or what are the cloud primitives we're going to use? How do we make sure it's got all the good attributes I talked about? And how do we empower the organization around us to be self-serve so that for some things they don't have to come file a ticket, they can just go do. They can go build and build fast. So figuring out where that boundary lies and then how do you empower the folks around you is one of the challenges of that platform team. Sometimes that's overkill. If you're a Series A startup, you probably are just going to give your developers the tools they need to run fast and build. But certainly in the enterprise, and certainly once you get to a certain scale and level of complexity, that sort of approach we're seeing emerge quite often.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit and dive into something that's sort of very relevant over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, we've talked about it a little bit on the show, but HashiCorp made an announcement that they are changing their license for all of their commercial products to something that's less friendly to the open source community, or at least to anybody who would like was either using or would like to use open source projects like Terraform as their part of their product or anything. You guys have come out and made some statements about that. I'm curious. Where do you see, I guess, a community like Terraform in which, yes, there was one company that was sort of controlling of it, but there was so many things downstream that were using it, that were providing value around it. Like, where do you, as a company who's, now having to sort of live with this, I'm sure your customers are asking about it. Like, how do you guys go forward thinking about, your interaction with open source communities, your commitment to open source? Obviously, you talked about, hey, you've got paying customers and you've got to do stuff in the open source. Like, how are you guys thinking about some of the changes that are happening around open source communities and licensing, and, where you've got dependencies, where you're leading? What's your thought process around all these things?
Yeah, first, open source is fundamental to everything Pulumi has ever done. We made that decision on day one. We were very thoughtful about it. I think one of the reasons that we're able to commit to open source is we were very thoughtful about what is the split between what's open source and what's commercial value. And to us, it's, hey, if it's in the infrastructure as code technology, it's open source. If it's in our Pulumi Cloud SaaS product, it's part of that, it's closed source. It's sort of like Git and GitHub, right? Git is open source and always will be. GitHub is closed source SaaS that you purchase if it makes sense. And you don't have to, but a lot of people do because it's the most secure, the most reliable, the most convenient way to adopt Git in an enterprise. I think one of the challenges with the current situation with the relicense is that wasn't necessarily the case for the Hashi suite of products, and so they sort of decided to relicense. And honestly, it's up to them. They get to make that decision, and they did. So, and I think the future for us, we stay the course. We're huge believers in open source, and we always will be. And I think there's a lot of people in the world that are. I think like Adam Jacob on Twitter, I love all of his thoughts around this. And there's definitely a large contingent in the world where that's important. I think the current license that's being used and has been used by several companies is frankly not open source by the definition the OSI puts out there. Like, it's sort of source available. You can go read the source, which is good, but it's not the same as being true open source. And I think there is a point at which all that stuff was open source before it got relicensed, and the OpenTF fork took it from that point forward. And we'll see. I'm a big fan of anything that's supporting open source, and so maybe they'll succeed in that. There's a fair bit of folks that are carrying that forward. I always think a fork is really tough though on the community. Because you need to get to critical mass, you need that to become the default, and if it never does, then it's basically stuck in a situation where it's got to keep up with feature parity, and otherwise they diverge, and that's really harmful to the entire community. So I think that's weighing on people right now, and honestly, I can't predict which way it's going to go. But I wish them the best. I do think it's a dangerous trend to see several companies going down this path. And I'd much rather people be more thoughtful at the outset about, how are we going to make money, and what if these things happen? Like, it shouldn't be a surprise that people can take your open source and do things you never intended with it. And maybe that will happen to Pulumi one day. And I frankly think that would be fine. That's why we open sourced it. It's there for the community. So that's just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's a complicated issue. Appreciate that.
Yep, makes perfect sense. Thank you for that, Joe. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. One final question for you. So one of the big things for our listeners is learning, and we have a lot of practitioners out there. And so kind of a twofold question. Number one, for those that maybe are new to the space and want to dig in, where would you suggest they go? And second of all, too, there's a webinar coming up. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about the webinar as well as a good place to get started?
For sure. I think there's a lot to learn in this space, it can be daunting, but it also is super exciting. With Pulumi, you get to learn the languages, you get to learn the cloud providers and all the architectures. So first, Pulumi.com, there's in the upper right, there's a little tab called Learn. Under there's webinars and blogs and videos and tutorials. Super easy to get started. Again, Pulumi is open source, and so there's free and easy to get started. We do always have workshops and webinars where it's really more hands-on. So like, hey, let's build a generative AI application together on Kubernetes, and we'll spend a couple hours doing that together. Again, those are free. It's really just for the community. We have 2 such workshops coming up, September 14th for Kubernetes and September 19th for Azure, building modern applications on both. But on that Learn tab, you'll see that we just have an endless stream of these coming up. And if you miss it, they go up on YouTube as well. So check it out. And we have a community Slack too. So if you want to join that, pulumi.com/Slack, we're all hanging out in there and ready to help.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Joe, thank you. Thank you as always for being back on the show, for being a friend of the show and kind of giving us some insight on this stuff, because this is a space that's it's evolved quite a bit over the years. People's preferences around infrastructure as code has changed, their usage patterns have changed, and obviously a lot of the other stuff has been evolving as well. But thank you so much for that. Any sort of last places if folks are wanting to engage with the team or learn around this space, beyond the webinar? What are some of the best places if folks want to engage with the Pulumi team to go about doing that these days?
Yeah, again, our community Slack is a fantastic place. There's tens of thousands of practitioners like yourself hanging out there. The whole team is there. We are doing the rounds on a lot of conferences coming up as well. I'm about to board a flight to go to Google Cloud next. We'll be in DevOps Days Tel Aviv. I'll be there personally. So kind of going global at this point. So swing by an event. We actually launched our user groups earlier this year. So we've got 8 of them across 6 different countries, and that's growing fast as well. So that's on meetup.com. So just look for Pulumi user group, PUG. Just join one of those. Fun, meet some of your peers, meet the team. And again, we're always here to help.
Yeah, good stuff. It's good to have people back meeting in person again around the world. So that's always a very good sign. Aaron, you want to wrap us up and take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Joe, thank you very much for your time today. And on behalf of Brian and myself, thank you everyone out there for listening. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend. Please, if you can, wherever you get your podcast, please leave us a review as well. That's always helpful. And we enjoy feedback. We have feedback through all the usual channels, and we're always looking for additional ideas for guests as well. So for that, I'm going to wrap up the podcast this week, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.